Now, what maybe you came here for this evening was to get some information from Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality, and they've been kind enough to send us Mr. Shaun Lehman, who's a geologist with Michigan DEQ in the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals. So he's going to share with us this evening some of his expertise, and we hope that you'll be able to get some of your questions answered. And he's going to just try to give you as much information as he can quickly, and then we'll have a time for question and answer after that. So if you'll give him your attention, thank you, Mr. Lehman, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I understand there's been some leasing in the area recently, and that's stirred up interest in what's going on. I and some of my coworkers attended a couple of meetings similar to this last year. I know the leasing was going on pretty intensely then. I don't know if it still is. Is anybody here dealing with any current leasing activity? Or are we still just kind of wondering what's going on with what happened last year? Well, I work for the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals, Department of Environmental Quality, and we're responsible for regulating oil and gas activity in Michigan. We don't get involved in the leasing process. That's a private agreement, but we issue permits, and we're involved with the life of an oil and gas well from the beginning to the end. So our staff in Lansing consists of a permitting unit, and that's where the process starts. An operator would issue an application for a permit to drill a well. The permitting unit deals with the well location and spacing. Once a permit is issued, if it's decided to drill the well, that's where my job typically starts as a field geologist. We have several area geologists like myself that function essentially as inspectors for the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals. And we spend most of our time in the field on drilling rigs, inspecting plugging work, well reworks, and even production of the wells. So we'll start by talking a little bit about the history of oil and gas in Michigan and what we currently have. The map to the right shows the location of wells in Michigan, and you can see that most of them are concentrated in pretty large clusters, especially some of the plays in northern Michigan. We've had about 60,000 wells drilled in the state since 1925. Summary of active wells on the left. Several oil and gas wells are in production. We have water injection and brine disposal wells. And we also have a pretty large group of gas storage wells in the state. And these are primarily using depleted oil and gas reservoirs to store natural gas to meet our heating demands in the winter. I'm going to start with the geology because this is really central to our regulations and the way wells are built in Michigan. The figures at the bottom are a depiction of a structure called the Michigan Basin, and the map to the right gives you an idea of the area that this basin covers. It's the entire lower peninsula, the eastern half of the upper peninsula, and it actually underlies the Great Lakes and some of this and parts of the surrounding states and even into Canada. At the top is a thin veneer of glacial sediments. In this area, the thickness of glacial deposits ranges from approximately 10 to 200 feet. And beneath that is where we get into our bedrock, our sedimentary bedrock that's part of the Michigan Basin. You can tell by the figure to the right that this is highly exaggerated, but the structure itself is shaped like a bowl, thickest in the center, thinnest at the margins. And at its thickest, near the city of Midland, it's about 15,000 feet. Beneath that sedimentary rock is the Precambrian crystalline basement rock that makes up the majority of our continental crust. The significance of the Michigan Basin in terms of oil and gas is that this is where our oil and gas resources lie. And it also includes a good deal of our freshwater resources. So this is a little bit more of a detailed stratigraphic log on the left. The figure we were looking at that depicted the Michigan Basin was dividing the layers of rock by geologic time, very generalized. This gives you an idea. It's hard to see exactly which formations are depicted on this log, but it at least shows that there's a complex succession of sedimentary rock, things like limestone, dolomite, shale, sandstone, gypsum, salt, all alternating layers of porous, permeable rock and more impermeable to semi-permeable rock. In this area, the upper 500 feet or so contains the freshwater resources that are available. That includes the glacial drift. I understand that in Lapeer County, about 25% of the water wells are completed in glacial drift, 75% in bedrock aquifers. And those consist primarily of the Michigan Formation and the Marshall Sandstone, which is a fairly prolific aquifer throughout much of the state. The bed of rock not far beneath the Marshall Sandstone is the Coldwater Shale. And that's a thick shale sequence that again underlies a good portion of the state and provides a very good impermeable layer that separates our freshwater resources from the brine and oil and gas bearing rock beneath the cold water. And that's in this area, that's specific to the Lapeer area. I've got a thickness of 600 to 1,400 feet. The Devonian rock that contains a lot of the oil and gas and brine that has been produced in the Lapeer County area lies directly beneath from 1,500 to 3,000 feet. In the Silurian age rock, there's a formation called the A1 carbonate that seems to be of interest here. That occurs at a depth of about 5,500 feet. So again, with drilling, this is where our field geologists like myself have a lot of involvement. Wells are drilled, multiple well bores, each lined with a sleeve of steel casing and cemented in place. This is going to be an animation of how the well bore is drilled and casing is installed. What you have here is a pipe called a conductor pipe that's driven into the ground to help consolidate the unconsolidated sediment at the surface. And that might be driven, anywhere from 20 to 100 feet. It's driven through a fusel. And this is done before the drilling begins. So the first string of casing that's installed is called a surface casing, and the purpose is to protect all freshwater resources. So in this case, the image is depicting a couple of freshwater aquifers floored with a layer of shale or competent bedrock. So the well bore is drilled 100 foot below freshwater resources and into competent bedrock. And then a string of casing is installed, and it's cemented to surface. Now this is probably one of the most important parts of well construction. This is what protects our freshwater resources from anything that might be produced or drilled into below. So this is something that we spend a lot of time during the permitting process, making sure we've got the right depth and the formation for the casing seat, and we've got all the known freshwater aquifers in the area protected. After the surface casing is installed, this depiction is going to be something similar to what you might see for an A1 carbonate well in this area. There's an intermediate casing that's installed, and that's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of half to a third of the total depth of the well. And so the well bore is drilled to a predetermined depth or formation. The casing is installed and again cemented in place. So you've got the surface and intermediate casing in the ground. The next step is to drill to the total depth of the well. There's a target formation, regardless of whether it's going to be a vertical well or directionally drilled or horizontal. In this case, there's a horizontal well depicted. And again, after the well bore is drilled, casing is installed and cemented in place. Now, after the well is drilled, you've got a borehole that's lined with steel and cement, closed off to all the formations that it goes through, so that the drilling rig moves off location at this point, and in comes a completion crew. And the purpose of well completion is to open the well bore up to the formation that you're intending to test or produce from. So the casing is perforated at that interval, and then, if necessary, the reservoir is stimulated. And in the past, in Michigan, one of the primary ways to stimulate a reservoir is by using acid, traditionally in carbonate rock, to clean up mud damage and to open up existing porosity in the rock. The other type of completion mentioned on that slide is, of course, hydraulic fracturing. Before we get into completion techniques, just a quick summary of the difference between a conventional and unconventional reservoir. Conventional reservoirs typically have a source rock topped with a reservoir type rock that's porous and permeable, and capped with an impermeable cap rock. And oftentimes this sequence has some sort of a structural trap, like an anticline depicted here, where the oil and gas will collect over time. Unconventional is referring to targeting the source rock itself. And oftentimes the source rock is of either low permeability or just impermeable altogether. And this is where the completion technique known as hydraulic fracturing came into play. So hydraulic fracturing, I'm sure you've all read various information about what it is. The idea is to basically force fluids and proppants through the well bore out the perforations that are created in the casing into the target rock or reservoir that you're trying to produce oil or gas from. And the idea is either to create fractures or enhance and help connect existing fractures in the rock to allow fluid or gas to flow to the well bore. And there seems to be sort of a preconceived notion that this is a gas drilling technology or a gas production technology, but this is actually used a lot to produce oil as well. The distinction here for this type of well completion is that it's used in tight rock. And it's not always shale. It can be carbonate-based rocks like the A1 carbonate that's being looked at in this area. It's a real tight limestone dolomite formation, and this type of completion has some use in that kind of rock. The next couple of slides are going to show you depictions of vertical wells and horizontal wells, and the point is just to show you that there's really not much different in the way that they're built and completed. The picture on the right depicting a vertical well, the casing that's exposed to the target formation has been perforated, and then it's hydraulically fractured. Now, the thing to note here is that many of the beds that are targeted in Michigan are maybe somewhat thin, like the A1 carbonate is here. So a vertical well isn't going to offer you much surface area with the target rock. So in that kind of situation, directional drilling, horizontal drilling technology helps increase the surface area of the well with the target formation. And it also allows an increased number of perforation or production intervals. The idea behind it is that, for one, this is a very complex and expensive type of completion. To drill multiple deep wells to the same formation and treat each one probably would be a lot more expensive than it would be to drill one that travels a large distance through the same bed of rock that can be completed in several different areas. So on one hand, this technology can replace several individual vertical wells, and on the other, it allows you to target the best part of the reservoir with one well bore. So typically what you see here in a horizontally drilled well is maybe a quarter to a mile, sometimes longer in other parts of the country, of horizontal well bore. Multiple perforations, multiple stages to complete. The main difference being, and mechanically it's very similar, vertical and hydraulic well completions, the main difference being the volumes of fluid necessary to treat those many intervals. And the next few slides are just pictures, just to give you an idea of what some of these sites look like. A typical drilling site in Michigan in the past has been maybe an acre or two pad. With the advent of high volume hydraulic fracturing, the amount of equipment necessary increases, the size of the pad increases, and oftentimes you're looking at a 3 to 5 acre pad. So at this stage in the process, all the drilling equipment is gone, the well has been drilled, this is all completion equipment. You're talking about, that's a shot of the wellhead. You're talking about pump trucks, you're talking about water storage tanks, depicted here. Some of the plumbing between the pump trucks and the wellhead, and chemical storage. A little bit of history. Some of you may have heard this story before, but hydraulic fracturing had its start in Michigan in the mid-1950s. This later on kicked off what's known as the Antrim Shale Play in northern Michigan. 12,000 plus wells that have been drilled into the Antrim Shale and hydraulically fractured, majority being in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. The 80s brought on directional drilling technology. This is what led to ultimately horizontal drilling. And in the Antrim, while that play was still hot, we've got 1,000 directionally drilled wells, 400 of them being horizontal. 2008 in Michigan brought about some interest in some of our deeper shale plays. And that brought about the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which we now call high volume hydraulic fracturing. Since 2008, we've issued approximately 2,200 oil and gas drilling permits, 50 of them being for proposed high volume hydraulic fracturing completion. And I think, I don't have the exact number, I think we're somewhere around 25 of them having been drilled and completed. So it really hasn't kicked off. It's not as significant as it's been in other parts of the country. There's still some interest in this kind of work. But for the most part, what we've seen since 2009 anyway has been a lot of the same, the kind of drilling that we've been used to in the past. After well completion, the completion crew moves off site, and it's time to flow back the fluids and test the well. And what happens after hydraulic fracture completion is that when the pressure is relieved from the wellhead, the fluid that's loaded the well casing flows back to the surface. It's containerized, and then the well goes on to test, meaning that formation fluids and gases begin to flow from the well. And the operator typically gets a 30-day test period to see what the well has, see whether it's worth sinking more money into, and whether it's going to have any kind of viable economic production. So during the test, the oil and water are separated. The formation water with the flowback fluid, the completion fluid, is disposed of together. And one of our many hundreds of brine disposal wells in the state. Our rules require containerizing of the fluid as it flows back and disposal in one of our injection wells. And if, as I said, if the test is successful and the well is put on production, the wellhead itself is required to have secondary containment. Production facility is typically built unless there's already one close by that can handle the production from the well. And our rules also require secondary containment for separation and treating vessels and storage tanks. The other part of the secondary containment rules that isn't depicted here is groundwater monitoring. Construction of a new facility requires completion of a hydrogeologic study of the site to determine background groundwater quality and direction of groundwater flow. Using that information, a permanent monitoring well is installed next to the tank battery, and that's sampled biannually and analyzed for leak detection. So our focus here for hydraulic fracturing is summarized. Most of this is addressed by our rules. Some of it by site-specific review. The first issue we'll deal with is water withdrawal. Our rules require the use of a tool called the Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool. I'll get into that in the next couple of slides. Our rules, since they've been updated in March, also now require some baseline water well sampling for water wells that are within a quarter of a mile of the site. And the Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool was developed by the DEQ to screen all proposed large water withdrawals. This was not created for the oil and gas industry. This includes irrigation withdrawals. This includes anything really that is going to use 100,000 gallons a day of water over a 30-day average. The system is based on the assumption that surface water and groundwater function together as one common hydrologic system, and it uses data from the Michigan groundwater inventory. Just some average numbers here for the amount of fluid used in hydraulic fracture completion in Michigan so far. 50 to 100,000 gallons in the Antrim shale play. That's on the high end. The high volume hydraulic fracture volumes that we've seen so far, the highest being in the Collingwood play in northern Michigan, up to 35 million gallons. The A1 carbonates varied quite a bit. Haven't been very many drills or wells that have been drilled horizontally into the A1 carbonate that have utilized this type of completion, but some have tried just to stimulate the well with a conventional acid job to start. Others have went right to the traditional hydraulic fracturing with the water and proppant-based carrier fluid. And then some have used sort of a hybrid completion. There's a completion method called an acid frac, nitrogen frac. You're just talking about using different base carrier fluids in those situations. And those two completion methods use significantly less water, from what we've seen so far anyways. Maybe 200 to 500,000 gallons on a 10 to 15 stage completion. And the ones in the A1 carbonate that have gone the way of traditional hydraulic fracturing have used water closer to 2 to 4 million gallons. Another protection safeguard in our rules aimed at water withdrawal is a requirement of a monitoring well if there is a residential water well within a quarter mile of the drilling site water supply well. And this has to be monitored, measurements taken, and submitted to the DEQ to watch for, basically to monitor drops in the water table while water is being withdrawn for the completion operation. Okay, so here's a summary of some of the requirements we have for hydraulic fracturing. I mentioned the water well. Our new rules also require a contingency plan be submitted that spells out how losses to nearby water supply wells are going to be mitigated. We need the third bullet point there is to point out that during the application process, a permittee has to inform us whether they intend to use high volume hydraulic fracturing, and if they don't, that's something they can remedy later on if they decide to, but they're still subject to the same requirements that a new permit would be. Someone like myself would get notified 2 days before the activity starts, after, of course, this has all been approved. And then after the completion, we require submission of record of all pressures and volumes recorded during the completion. So chemical additives is a big talking point. The figure on the right is meant to pair with the type of hydraulic fracturing that uses water as a primary carrying fluid. Majority of the slurry being sand and water. The chemical additives, including things like hydrochloric acid, biocides, corrosion inhibitors, scale inhibitors, cross-linkers and breakers. There's a long list of potential chemicals that could be used, and most wells or fields anyway have their own recipe. And of the hundreds that are advertised, you're typically talking about 10 to 20 additives that might be added to the fluid. Our rules also require the posting of MSDS sheets on site during completion for all chemicals that are on site. Disclosure is done through fracfocus.com, which is a type of national clearinghouse for hydraulic fracturing information. Disclosure includes the chemical name and concentration, unless the chemical is a trade secret chemical, in which case they're allowed to submit a trade name and chemical family information. One other note about that is that that's again, as I said, that's a topic that people are very concerned with and interested in. One thing that I'll note is that one of the objections that I've noticed to be pretty common is that the records for chemical disclosure in the past have always been due with completion records, which are due 30 days after completion. I've seen very little of this activity in my area. One well, and it was last year. But for all the people that were interested and really wanted to know what was being used in the fluid, You know, I was happy to provide whatever information I had. I had copies of MSDS sheets my first day on site, and again, you know, if there's anything like that I can help you with, I'm happy to, even if it's something we haven't officially received yet. So this will be another one of interest after the earthquake this weekend, induced seismicity. There have been some problems linked to injection wells in other states with induced seismicity, specifically places like Texas and Oklahoma and Ohio. Oftentimes, from what I've read, stories related to this type of activity, it often gets linked directly to hydraulic fracturing, which doesn't appear to be true. There's been some minor seismic activity recorded due to hydraulic fracturing, but it's very rare. Some of the conditions that need to exist for these problems to occur are listed here. So existing faulting and high stress in the crust, high pressure and volume of fluid, and close to the basement rock. And the reason that's pointed out and why that's important here is that most of our drilling, in fact, all of our oil and gas production and disposal in Michigan is in the sedimentary basin that sits atop the basement rock. So there's quite a bit of isolation between our basement rock and our sedimentary basin, and it's an important distinction to be made because looking at the earthquake from Saturday, for instance, that had an epicenter reported of 3.5 miles. And that area in Kalamazoo, the basin is less than 1 mile thick. So that's well into the basement rock and well away from the reach of any oil and gas activity. This last slide is just to give you an idea of how that type of seismic event associated with hydraulic fracturing, for instance, would compare. And this actually, being that the earthquake Saturday was a 4.2, I'm not sure how many of you felt it here, but I definitely did. Just to give you an idea of the difference in magnitude. The Richter scale is logarithmic. There's not a linear increase from one magnitude to the next. So that's a great deal more disturbance than the half magnitude that's reported up here for hydraulic fracturing. And that's it. As I said, this is meant to be a primer. There's a lot of very general information in here. And partly because this is a wide-reaching topic, there's a lot of information to cover. So I thought it'd be best just to leave it to the questions that you might have.
They want me to repeat the question.
Okay.
This morning on Good Morning America, across the scroll, I read every morning, excuse me, they said that in Pennsylvania they've discovered fracking fluid in their fresh water supply. What might cause that?
I heard that was actually being broadcast on the radio as I pulled into the parking lot, and I didn't get to hear the whole story, so I don't have the details. But typically, whether you're talking about hydrocarbons or fluid used in completion, it's hard to say. I mean, was it related to the completion work, or was it related to handling of the flowback fluid? There's a lot of different things that can happen, but well integrity is what keeps completion fluids or even production fluids from moving back up the well bore. The other side of it is, as I said, the production and flow back when you're dealing with the human element and handling and transporting of those fluids. That's where most of the problems we've had historically have occurred is on the production side. I'm not sure about Pennsylvania.
And a follow-up to that, if we're storing the fluid that's pumped back out down in wells, storage facility underground, how do we protect against earthquakes and things like that could release it? I mean, there's a lot of unforeseen things here. It just seems like it'd be better to take it and have it recycled or something like that than to store
Yeah,
it.
if it could be. There are places, Pennsylvania for one, where I understand they're starting to recycle some of that fluid, and by recycle I mean reuse, not necessarily treat. It's difficult to treat, not just because of the constituents that are added to it, but when that fluid comes back to the well, it's not the same fluid that went down. It's mixed with formation brine, and most wastewater treatment plants aren't equipped to deal with removal of the salts that are in the brine. That's why we require disposal of it in Michigan. It is injected with produced brine. The recycling part of it is probably going to be tough to do here in Michigan unless things ever really kick off and really get rolling, because to reuse it with that amount of fluid, it just wouldn't make any sense to try to store it at the surface. Now, if you had one well being drilled after another, where that fluid could be transported immediately from one well to the next, that's where it works. But here, you know, we just haven't really seen it kick off the way it has in other places to take advantage of that kind of.
Well, I hope it doesn't kick off.
But as far as the injection wells go, and your question there about that being a potential problem down the road, I'll put it to you this way: a lot of the zones that we're using for disposal are the same types of zones that are producing oil or gas, or that the brine is coming from anyway. So you're putting produced brine into a formation that holds brine. Now, if an earthquake, and I understand your concern is more with the fluid that's used for completion being mixed in with that. If you look at it, if you look at these brine and oil and gas bearing formations as a type of aquifer, they dwarf our freshwater aquifers here. The amount of volume that they can hold, the completion fluid from one of these wells is a drop in the bucket. Quickly becomes unrecognizable underground. But it's a valid concern, and what I would say to that is, if we did have some sort of a catastrophic earthquake that created some kind of a conduit from those depths to the surface, we've already got the majority of those porous formations already are holding brine, and that alone would create some problems.
I have a grandson-in-law that has worked in the fracking in Pennsylvania, and he was on, after the well was drilled, they were forcing water down and then bringing the fracking material up, and then they separated as it came out of the well, the sand, the gas, and the chemical. And they would store it, and every night a big tanker truck would come in and pick it all up. And he said he took it someplace and they recycled it, or whatever they did to it. But
yeah,
he says it's very dangerous work too.
I don't know if there's been any success treating the water elsewhere. It's actually been a problem in some other states. That fluid can overwhelm a treatment facility, and what you could end up with is just untreated water going out the other end. And I know that actually has been a problem in some places. In the back?
What do you think about the state of New York prohibiting fracking altogether? Government.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know about as much as you do about that particular issue.
We have a question right here.
On the horizontal perforations, how far does the fracking go out? In all directions, a mile or what?
It depends a lot on the depth and the orientation of the bedding of the rock. So when you talk about sedimentary rock like shale, or even some shaly limestones and dolomites, they're bedded, and the bedding planes are often the weakest point in the rock.
Okay,
So-
let's take
so-
the weakest and the strongest.
Well-
It'll go out anywhere from 100 feet to 3 miles, or what?
I'll get to that, because there's a little bit of a distinction there. When you're in the Antrim Shale Play in northern Michigan, those are all fairly shallow wells, less than 2,000 feet. There's less overburden on the rock, so that bedding plane is still the weakest point. And oftentimes in those completions, they could open up fractures for quite a distance. I don't know.
Quite a distance in all
No,
directions?
laterally.
Laterally?
Now, when we're talking about doing the same thing at depth in a horizontal well, you're pushing the fracture fluid up and down through the well bore. At greater depths, the overburden on top of that bed of rock can turn that plane of weakness into a strength because of all the weight sitting on top of it, and the fractures may better propagate in and up and down. What I've heard, and I don't have any proof of this, but in Michigan, most operators I talk to are thinking somewhere maybe around 100 feet max. And it really depends on how it's designed. These are engineered to propagate only a certain distance, because this thin bed of A1 carbonate, for instance, which would be the target here.
Okay, I was just wondering, in general,
Okay.
how far?
It varies so much that I can't give you a general, because it's engineered to
Okay.
go a certain distance.
How deep do they store the storage wells? How deep are
Wide
those,
variation
and are they
there.
under pressure?
Wide variation there. Would you go back to my original geology slide? But typically deeper than 1,000 feet, sometimes a few thousand feet. The same formation in Michigan is going to be at a different depth at many different places. So the A1 carbonate here is 5,500 feet approximately. In other parts of the state, it's going to be much deeper, and on the edges of the state, much shallower. But the reason I want to bring up the geology slide is to point out something important about disposal wells. There's mention here about freshwater aquifers and the cold water shale. Typically, the disposal wells are in the Devonian age rock beneath the cold water shale. That gives a lot of impermeable isolation from the injection zone to the freshwater aquifers.
Is the disposal under pressure or not?
Typically not. A lot of no. The disposal wells are drilled into formations that are under pressure typically, because that allows you to. It'll take the fluid on vacuum or on gravity. But typically, yeah, on a disposal well, depending on the volume that it's seeing, it'll take it pretty easily. Yes.
I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and I'm very much aware of the drilling going on in Pennsylvania and what it's done for their economy. Williamsport, Pennsylvania, for example, was in a real depressed situation until they got into they really got their drilling program going. And you see, it's the same shale that is in Pennsylvania, I understand, does extend into New York. Yet New York has stopped all fracking, you know, for now and in the future. Is it fair for them to get gas from Pennsylvania? And I know that's a dumb question, but it bothers me that they can do that.
Yeah, it's kind of the same argument about, you know, drilling units, you know, and wells right next to each other, and how far does the well reach and that sort of thing. But in terms of a shale well, I don't know what their drilling units look like there, but here, that type of well might be drilled on a 40, 80, or 640 acre drilling unit, and that's really the area you expect that fluid or gas to move through to the well bore. So as far as it crossing state lines, especially in a tight shale rock, I wouldn't expect it to be able to go very far at all.
Shaun, you know me,
Yep.
and I live next to a gas well and a high-pressure DTE pipeline. can you guarantee me and the rest of us here that my well will never be contaminated, and will you buy my house? And the last question for you is, explain to them what would happen to this area if we use the Matthews 1 and the Wilkerson well as a disposal well.
Okay, I'll start with your questions about your house. And
No, just
no, I can't, obviously would never guarantee that a well or drilling isn't going to cause a problem, because we've had problems with spills and that sort of thing. That's why it's regulated. If there were no danger to it, there wouldn't be as many people as there are like me regulating that activity in this state. And I understand your concern with that, but there is a risk. I mean, there's a reason that the oil and gas companies are leasing the oil and gas rights from you. And entering into a lease, you're entering into a partnership for that well. And you're the one that's looking out for your land. And there certainly is a risk anytime you drill a hole into the earth at great depth. There are things at depth that you don't want mixing with your fresh water, and it's very important that wells are drilled and constructed properly to prevent that from happening. Now, what would happen if the Wilkinson, there's 2 brine production wells in Lapeer County, the Wilkinson and the Matthews, up in the Rich Township area, close to where Gary lives, and these are producing brine. Now, the field that Gary lives next to is producing from the Detroit River group of rocks. The Sylvania sandstone that's producing brine, the 2 wells that are producing brine in that area are producing from the Sylvania sandstone, which directly underlies the Detroit River group, around 3,000 feet. That water is not, that formation is not overpressured, it's underpressured. So there's a possibility that could, it's not typically a target for disposal in Michigan because it's a good brine source, but it's possible. And you wanted to know what would happen if, what specifically, physically or from a permitting standpoint, or?
shallow wells.
No, they're not.
They're deep? How
Yeah,
deep do they go?
those are around 3,000 feet.
Well, typically wells are 2 miles deep on a vertical.
No, it varies a great deal. And in the Antrim Shale in northern Michigan, somewhere less than 1,000 feet. Now, the wells in the Richfield, close to your house, are right in that 3,000 foot range. Yep.
So if they dispose of that dirty water, or as you call it, produced water,
Mhm.
into those brine wells, that's the big controversy.
Okay, so you're taking brine and putting it into a brine-bearing formation. That's the idea behind a disposal well. You're putting.
Well, disposal water contains carcinogens and radioactive tracers.
So does oil and brine.
Yeah, that's because you're bringing that water back up.
Right, but that's my point, is that you're putting the Sylvania sandstone, the Traverse limestone, the Dundee limestone, these are all, the Sylvania is not, but just for purpose of your question, those are traditional disposal zones, and they do hold oil, gas, brine. There's carcinogens in oil too. The idea is you're putting it back into a formation that's already unusable water, obviously, because it's salt water for one, but some of them also have trace or substantial amounts of hydrocarbons too.
So what you're saying is there's no guarantee once that dirty water goes into the brine well that it would not contaminate my fresh water supply.
My concern would be how it's handled at the surface. I wouldn't be as concerned with the disposal of it myself. The way the disposal wells are built just like oil and gas wells. They've got multiple strings of casing that are cemented in place and all that. And the way they work, I think this is of interest to a lot of people because it's sometimes advertised recklessly. That's my feeling anyway, that we're just pumping waste into the ground. There isn't any mention of where it's going or how the wells are constructed or what safeguards are in place. But when I say it's constructed like an oil or gas well, there's one point of entry and one exit. So it would be difficult, and there are some extra safeguards for injection wells, including mechanical integrity testing that's done regularly, that's required by the DEQ and the EPA. We have joint authority over inspection wells. So that's my personal feeling. I understand the sentiment, but my thought is that if the more likely cause for an issue with the disposal wells, mishandling at the surface.
Could you tell the audience about the spill report, the DEQ spill report?
The DEQ spill report, how it works? Okay, so if an operator has a spill or a loss, there are different reporting requirements, and it's based on the volume lost, how quickly it was discovered. But typically, reportable losses are 42 gallons, assuming that, 42 gallons or above, assuming that the spill gets cleaned up quickly. If it's something that is discovered more than a day after it happened, and it's less than 42 gallons, we still require notification of the spill and follow-up of a report. The idea behind the notification is that if there is a spill, we want to know about it because we want to make sure it's cleaned up correctly and quickly. If it's not cleaned up quickly, then there's possibility that it's impacted not only the soil but the groundwater.
Okay, I have a question right here.
Okay.
All right. Well, I want to thank the Tea Party leadership for bringing you in and educating people on this and bringing up the topic, and thank you for all the information you're sharing. I would just really encourage everyone. I got involved with this for a couple different reasons. My family owns a real estate company, so we became concerned when we saw a national trend of devaluation of properties that were close to any drill site. And then we started looking into it more, and I started talking to my well drilling friends, and I can't find one well driller that supports fracking because they're trying to deliver clean drinking water. And what they said was generally it's safe unless you have a failure, you know, like you're saying in the drill shaft. And they said it's not a matter of if, but when a shaft failure will happen, releasing those toxins. And it just seems the more people I talk to as far as scientists and people that are some of the most educated that I know that are not on the payroll of the energy companies doing this are 100% opposed to this. I just encourage everybody, do your due diligence and look this stuff up online, and we should ban fracking in Michigan, and that's banfrackinginmichigan.org. And we are the largest aquifer, the largest freshwater source in the world, and we're kind of going into a global water crisis right now, and to be messing with this in Michigan is not to our benefit. And I have another friend, he makes his living going around and cleaning up all the fraccidents all over this country, and the results are devastating to the local communities. Nothing good comes from this except the people who own stocks in the company. So you might want to look how your money's invested and maybe invest in clean energy.
Do we have another question? Okay, right here.
You opened your presentation questioning leasing and interest in leasing. To your understanding, what's the time frame that citizens of Lapeer can expect something to come into this region?
It's no idea, really. And the reason is that sometimes leasing just doesn't amount to anything. My thought on it is that last year, when leasing activity was high, the price of oil was high, people were probably more, the industry was probably more friendly to drilling wildcat type wells, you know, something less than a sure thing. So now here we are with much lower oil prices, and not many people are drilling, and not many people are taking chances. I would say that makes a project like this probably lower priority to the person that was interested, but no telling. Most leases, and I'm not an expert on leasing, but I know that most leases are generally somewhere in the neighborhood of, you know, a 5-year, maybe at the most 10-year lease. So if they've got a significant investment in leasing, they might have some motivation there to do something, but I really don't know. Haven't really heard any buzz about this area. We haven't received any permit applications or anything like that. So Hard to say.
Okay, we
I
have...
will say this, though, I'm sorry,
go
just
ahead.
if you ever do, you know, Gary's gotten to know me a little bit the last year or so. If you ever have questions, you can feel free to call me. I'm sure I'm not going to be able to answer all of them tonight, so I'll at least make sure anybody that's interested has my contact information.
Shaun, do you have time for just one or two more
Sure.
questions?
Yep.
Okay, we'll do that.
Well, to kind of answer his, I know there was a lot of activity in the Mayfield Township, and I know I live in Oregon Township, and I think right now they've put a moratorium on it. So, although, because a lot of the farmers were concerned. One question, I have a couple. One question I have is, do you or does somebody regulate the seismic activity in Michigan? Because I'm really curious. I feel tremors really often, and I know I'm really sensitive to them because I did mission work in Indonesia where, hey, they had an earthquake that was 8 point something. It sounded like a freight train going through, and they billed for it. But I feel seismic activity a lot. It's very, very mild. A lot of people won't notice it, and I even kind of think, was that something? But one time I had a glass of water sitting on the floor, and it was shimmering. And
Yeah.
it was like, yeah, that was activity.
We don't actually monitor it. The U.S. Geological Survey does, and they post seismic data, seismic events on their website. And I don't know what the threshold is. I know most people will say anything less than a 2 and definitely a 3 is hard to feel by most people.
Well, I'm probably really sensitive because
Yeah,
I slept on a
very well
cot
be.
in
And
Indonesia.
there are man-made sources of seismic activity in the past, and when the mining boom was going on in UP, that caused some seismic events. But yeah, there is a record on the USGS website, and I can help you find that if you want to look into it.
Okay. Another question. I know Michigan State, I've heard they're doing a lot of study into this, their public health department, and some of their other departments. Have you heard about what any of those studies are revealing?
Are you talking about hydraulic fracturing or seismic?
Yes. And
I guess I'm not aware of what Michigan State's got going on and where they're at in that process.
Well, I guess
But-
my biggest concern is I'm a nurse, and I've heard Michigan State already has the highest incidence of muscular sclerosis in the whole country. I know hydraulic fracturing wouldn't be just the cause of it, but we've had so many chemical dumps from the car factories. We had a chemical dump, they were dumping it at night by the Flint River just down the road from us. And a lot of people ended up with all kind of cancer things and everything else. We have all these trash sites, I call them trash mountains, from Canada. It just seems like we're already so much compromising the health of Michigan somehow. With all the farmers and all their chemicals, I hope none of you are farmers. I appreciate you. But, I mean, we're already compromising our health so much.
Yeah, it's something that you're right, every state grapples with it. You've got increasing populations, increasing waste streams, what to do with it, increasing demands for energy. I mean, it's all stuff that has to be balanced. And what I'll say about it in terms of hydraulic fracturing is that that's why our focus as an agency is on well integrity with this sort of thing. The safest, if this kind of activity is going to occur, the safest way, the best thing I think we can do in terms of safeguards is make sure that the wells are built correctly so that the fluid that is being used is delivered from one point and exits one point, and when it comes back, it's properly handled.
All right, well, thank you for your time. And you said, would you be willing to just stick around for a couple minutes?
Absolutely. Yep.
I knew there were a couple questions we didn't get to, but I got the time sign, so we got to end it. And so thank you.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thank you.